Still no ceasefire, and the root causes remain. The Alaska summit didn't deliver a cessation of hostilities, but still, both parties tout progress with few details. So, will U.S., Ukrainian, and European leaders take tangible steps toward peace at their Washington meeting? Or is Russia's war on Ukraine bound to continue? I'm Andrea Sankin. Today's Newsmaker is Ukraine's peace talks. Well, those hoping for an end to the war in Ukraine had their hopes dashed on Friday when the Putin-Trump summit failed to produce a ceasefire. But on Monday, new hope is circling around a meeting between Ukraine's President Zelensky and his European counterparts, hosted by President Trump. But with Moscow making it clear that until root causes, basically the foundation for its invasion, are solved, peace will not be declared. So is progress really being made, or is the process still at a very stubborn square one? Here's a look.
Alaska, the site of an unprecedented meeting that just a few years ago would have been thought of as impossible. Russian President Vladimir Putin landing on American soil for bilateral talks with the US President Donald Trump. Red carpets and military flyovers marking the occasion, while thousands of miles away, Russia continues its war on Ukraine. The purpose of these meetings to bring an end to the war and halt Russian advances, despite one key player, Ukraine, being absent from the invite list.
We had an extremely productive meeting and many points were agreed to. There are just a very few that are left. Some are not that significant. One is probably the most significant. But we have a very good chance of getting there. We didn't get there, but we have a very good chance of getting there. I would like to thank President Putin and his entire team, who I know in many cases.
Speaking after the meetings, Vladimir Putin praising the progress.
The conversation was very frank, informative, and, in my opinion, it brings us closer to the necessary solutions.
According to US officials, Putin has acquiesced to the possibility of a US-EU-Ukraine security agreement. It wouldn't be NATO, but rather NATO-like in its language and its functions. But precise details of how this would work are unclear and unannounced. Putin has long been adamant Ukraine joining NATO is a red line for Russia. And Putin demanded concessions from Ukraine of his own. Ukraine, according to Putin, must give up the Donetsk region of the Donbass in Ukraine's east. More than 75% of this region is already under Russian control. Trump also hinted that the Crimean Peninsula will not be returned to Ukraine, a region which was annexed by Russia in 2014. Zelensky will find these conditions impossible to accept. He has regularly said no Ukrainian territory will be ceded to Russia. Ukrainians, their own armed forces, and the constitution itself make Russian demands of Ukrainian territorial forfeiture a non-starter of a demand.
First of all, I don't know what Putin and President Trump actually discussed. I would like Trump to share many details with me and then with European leaders. What President Trump told us about the signal regarding security guarantees is much more important to me than Putin's thoughts, because Putin will not give us any security guarantees. A strong army is the only thing that can provide security guarantees. Only Ukraine can provide this.
Zelensky's meetings over the weekend in Brussels preceded him flying out to meet Trump in Washington on Monday. Trump now pressing for what Ukraine believes is a Russian desire for a comprehensive peace deal while fighting still continues, instead of the previously stated desire in Ukraine for a ceasefire first. But Zelensky goes armed with the support of European leaders in near lockstep behind him.
Well, joining me now to look further at the efforts to broker peace between Russia and Ukraine are from Moscow, political analyst Dmitry Babich. From Washington, director of the Future of DHS project at Atlantic Council, Thomas Warrick. And Alexander Rodnyansky is the former economic advisor to President Zelensky and associate professor of economics at Cambridge University. Thank you all so much for being with me. Dmitry, I'll start with you because we'll start with the Alaska summit. And if you can, tell us how it's played out in Russia. Is it being praised? Is it seen perhaps as a formal recognition now of the Russian position?
Well, I wouldn't say that people care too much about Russia being recognized in the West. I mean, look at it from, by the eyes of an average Russian. We never suffered too much from Putin not traveling to Europe or to the United States. The merchandise that we used to get from Europe and from the United States, we're getting it through third countries, through CIS countries, former Soviet republics, through Arab countries.
Sure,
China.
but I mean, for the position that Putin and Russia has taken in what they want recognized as for their demands in this war.
That is another matter. People, of course, are divided. There are skeptics, there are optimists, but in general, the mood is positive. Some people even compare it to the mood that we had in 1987 when President Reagan, for the first time, came to Moscow, and they got along pretty well with Gorbachev on the Red Square. So basically, people are mostly talking about the future, not about the past. And in this program, I wouldn't like to talk too much about who is at fault for what happened. I think we all have a lot of things to say about it. In Russia, people are mostly looking to the future. Will the nightmare end? And believe it or not, Russians view what's going on as a nightmare, not only for themselves, because this is not reported in the Western press, but cities, especially on the border with Ukraine, are attacked by drones and by missiles on the daily basis. I know a few friends in places like Kaluga or Belgorod, and they all are familiar with the sound of drones. They can tell them one from another, just regular people, living in the center of these cities. So a lot of people are thinking about the settlement. Of course, people don't want an unconditional truce, which would be just a respite for the Ukrainian forces. They are looking forward to a settlement, to some kind of an agreement that would give guarantees of security to Ukraine and to Russia. We would like it to be a guarantee of neutrality, not a collective security agreement, which the EU wants to force on us. But there are many ways to guarantee security.
Okay. Well, before you go too far, let's just get the other opinions on how the.
That we're looking forward to neutrality. That's the end of my speech.
Okay. Well, that's one of the asks, at least it seemed Putin put forward at the Alaska summit. So, Alexander, tell me what's being made of it in Ukraine, because now President Zelensky is saying that Russia is trying to humiliate diplomatic efforts going into this Washington meeting by continuing attacks and killing more people. I mean, is the outlook in Ukraine at all more optimistic, feeling that at least a step was taken with Trump meeting Putin?
That's right. So obviously there's a very large amount of war fatigue in Ukraine among the general population. People are definitely seeking some sort of settlement, ceasefire, peace deal ideally, where we would freeze the front line. There is a widespread consensus by now that taking back all of the occupied territories through military terms is probably infeasible in the near future. People accept that. But at the same time, people are fearful of the new settlement being unstable. In other words, there must be some sort of security guarantee so that Russia doesn't do this again. And I want to remind the viewers that, of course, you have to remember how all of this started if you do want to address the root causes, as the Russian side sometimes claims that they want to. And it started through Russian aggression, and it continues to be Russian aggression. So we have to make sure that somehow that doesn't repeat itself, because otherwise it would be more helpful for Russia, in fact, not for Ukraine, to get this pause and to regroup and then launch a new offensive.
And
so
I mean,
that's really, it's important not to get that twisted up.
Yeah, and that's the
And,
issue. I mean, as Dmitry was saying, we don't want to look at the past and look at anymore at who started this, what the history is, but that is what the root causes are all about. So it's going to be very difficult if this is presidents. It wasn't sometimes, as you said, Russia sometimes claims the root causes need to be addressed. They constantly claim it. So, okay, we'll talk further about that, but I need to get Thomas's opinion in there on the Alaska summit. I mean, especially, Thomas, from an American standpoint, given there was really no opportunity for the press to even ask questions properly after their meeting, and a lot of key details are still very unclear. How is it looking in the United States?
Well, if the Alaska summit was a high stakes meeting, today's meeting in Washington is an even higher stakes meeting. No one thought 4 days ago that we would be talking about what kind of security guarantees NATO countries could be giving Ukraine to prevent a repeat of the Russian invasion from February 2022. But here is where we are. And this, in many ways, I think, shocked a great many people, both President Trump's most fervent supporters, many of whom see this war as a folly and don't want to support Ukraine. But the majority of Americans are deeply skeptical about Russia and its intentions, and think that Vladimir Putin has not given up his idea to erase Ukraine's independence. And so I can imagine that this meeting this afternoon is going to have the European leaders telling President Trump the only way he comes out of this looking like a winner is if Ukraine's independence is preserved, even against possible future Russian aggression. And they're all very well aware that Putin will try to veto any actual security guarantees, and that's probably where this will fall apart. But that actually is a couple months away.
Okay, so Dmitry, on those security guarantees, then moving forward, it's clear Ukraine wants, obviously, some kind of security guarantees. So what does qualify here? We know NATO is clearly off the table for Russia, but if there are NATO-like security measures to ensure that whatever settlement is made is kept as such, and that there can be no further what Ukraine would see as Russian aggression in the near future or far future, would that be acceptable for Russia?
Well, of course, any kind of NATO guarantee or a European Union security guarantee would not be accepted by Russia simply because this is one of the root causes that you mentioned of this conflict. Russia absolutely does not accept Ukraine becoming a member of NATO. Vladimir Putin acquiesced to the Baltic republics becoming members of NATO in 2004. That was a huge concession, which was never appreciated by the West. You know, the Baltic countries, we were told, would be peaceful after that. They would not be so nervous about Russia. Unfortunately, the opposite was true. They became a lot more hostile to Russia after joining NATO. And there are absolutely no reasons to believe that with Ukraine it will be otherwise. So the variant of collective security, you know, Ukraine being protected as a full NATO member or as a de facto NATO member or as a friend of NATO, that is unacceptable. But there are many other ways to guarantee Ukraine's security. Our suggestion is to guarantee it in the same way as Switzerland's or Finland's security was guaranteed during the Cold War. The EU, the United States, and Russia could agree that Ukraine is a neutral state. This status of Ukraine as a neutral state should be protected. That would suit everyone, and that would be, by the way, that would be in accordance with Ukrainian initial constitution. In 1991, when Ukraine became independent, the neutrality status was enshrined in Ukraine's constitution. Ukraine was a democratic country then. Unfortunately, it stopped to be a democratic country in 2014 when killing 38 policemen, a very aggressive group of Ukrainian nationalists, came to power in Ukraine. They entered the parliament. From that moment on, the parliament started to pass absolutely different resolutions from the ones it used to pass before. And Ukraine stopped to be a democratic state. There was no longer any discussion on foreign policy orientation of Ukraine, only pro-Western, only anti-Russian. And if Ukraine could return to its initial constitution, that would be fine. Unfortunately, the Ukrainian constitution was changed after the coup, after the Maidan coup. Ukraine enshrined in its constitution the aspiration to join NATO and the EU, and that became the root cause of this conflict, one of
Okay.
the main. And this root cause should be removed from the
Okay.
Ukrainian.
Well, then let me ask Alexander. I mean, that it sounds logical. Would Ukraine accept Finland-type status during the Cold War of neutrality? Would that be fair? Plus, yeah, the other conditions that Dmitry was mentioning. But I am assuming that there would have to be some land ceded as well to Russia. And is Ukraine also not going to accept that?
Yeah, so look, I mean, there's a lot of different issues there that you just mentioned and that were mentioned by the previous speaker. And it would take a long time to address everyone individually. But I will say the main few things. NATO accession, or the prospect of Ukraine's NATO accession, which was never close, ever, was used as a pretext, as an excuse to invade. We all know that. NATO's presence at the eastern borders was reduced to almost a vanishingly small proportion before the invasion. It was never a threat, a real threat, if you look at the numbers in the troops stationed in Europe before the 2022 full-scale invasion. That's just the fact, and there's no denying. So when Russia says that, it's pure manipulation. Now, when you look at the Swiss or Finnish or other models, these countries are not at war, right, when they chose neutrality. There wasn't a real pertinent threat that they had to deal with. Our country is at 20% occupied by Russia, and it's somewhat hard to make the claim in that setting that it should be neutral somehow when it's fighting for its existence, right? So I think these are the main things to keep in mind. And when we talk about security guarantees, acceptable or not, there has to be something tangible, whether you call it Article 5 or whatever else you want to call it, whether you want to use South and North Korea as the model, perhaps, that would work. But we need probably troops stationed on the ground to make sure there is a real mechanism in place, a tangible one, to keep Russia from attacking again. Otherwise, there's no point. This is just a pretext for a careful manipulative strategy thought out of how to blame Ukraine and yet another episode of escalation in the near future to then perhaps take even more territory. We all know that it's not NATO, it's Ukraine's sovereignty. And by the way, yes, there have been a lot of reforms in Ukraine since 2014. Let's remember that. And those brought Ukraine a lot closer to being a fully democratic sovereign state rather than a less democratic sovereign state. Yes, Ukraine is imperfect. It's not as democratic perhaps as Western Europe, but that's not what we're discussing here. There's no question. And there's widespread scientific, political, whatever consensus that Ukraine did become a lot more democratic. This is the 6th elected president in Ukraine after its independence in 1991. So let's not go into this, whether Ukraine is democratic or not. The Russians are not to tell us about democracy.
Okay, let me, I also, and Alexander, actually, I have to stay with you for a minute because your democracy, yes, it has developed. I don't think anyone can deny that. Russia can still take issue with it, that it isn't the democracy that they feel should be fully respected, but it has developed, which is why there are talks of potential EU accession in the future. But for right now, Russia sees the democratic constitution that Ukraine says it has as inflexible and written, especially when it comes to the clause that says that no territory can be ceded to Russia in negotiations, even if it is majority Russian speaking. Could any of that potentially be changed in negotiations, or is that a non-starter for Ukraine altogether?
Given the way it is phrased right now, I think it's a non-starter for the vast majority of the population. And that's ultimately what matters, because we have to take account, as opposed to Russia, of what our population thinks. Because if our leaders do not, they end up being ousted. And we saw that before, by the way, in exactly 2014, when a pro-Russian authoritarian leader tried to change course and do whatever he thought was necessary, but wasn't supported by the wide majority of the population. So let's remember that, speaking of democracy. Now, when it comes to ceding territory, look, if we're not talking at the same time about tangible security guarantees, as I said, about reparations from Russia, about a host of other issues, and if we're actually just rewarding the aggressor, then this is a no-go. Now, whether something else is feasible is to be determined in a real negotiations process where both sides make tangible, real steps forward and are willing to compromise and cede something on their part, and that's not happening right now. So I don't think we should be talking about seizing our territory and leaving our people behind.
I mean, Tom, we're hearing two very tough positions here, and very entrenched positions, to be honest. And now it all falls into the hands of the U.S. president. He is, many have mentioned, especially in the recent context, that he is very eager to secure a Nobel Peace Prize. This would be a huge accomplishment for him. But we have seen that he often doesn't get what he says he's going to get and what he ultimately wants. And people are now comparing this meeting with Putin to what he said he would get out of Kim Jong-un when he met him in Singapore. So, yeah, Trump changed tact 180 degrees toward North Korea in that sense. Would he do that again to Putin, or do you think his path is firmly set with his softer tone on Russia, or could he flip that again and go again into the sanctions, threatening sanctions against Russia? What do you see happening?
Well, with President Trump, everything is possible. He is a very personalistic style of leadership, and much depends on his mood. And as foreign leaders from Putin to Europe to elsewhere have learned, flattery gets you a lot with President Trump. But this is why this is such an extraordinary moment. Many in the United States are really thinking that Trump and his advisor, Steve Witkoff, see this as a real estate deal. In other words, giving up a piece of real estate in return for something else. Whereas a lot of people are trying to explain to President Trump, as we just heard from Moscow, this is seen as an existential one where Putin wants to erase Ukrainian sovereignty. And for that, no amount of territory is sufficient. And this is the problem. I had to laugh when I heard the word Finland mentioned in this context, because Finland is now a member of NATO, like Turkey, like many other European nations that are prosperous and secure. And the reason for that, ironically, is Vladimir Putin. If Putin had not invaded Ukraine, Finland would not be a member of NATO today, neither would Sweden. And this is the horrible irony of history. If Putin hadn't invaded Ukraine, Ukraine would be more friendly to Russia than it is now. What has happened is that Putin has ignited Ukrainian nationalism in a way that there will be no going back from. And while President Trump and indeed the Ukrainian and Russian people want peace, the problem is peace on whose terms? Because right now, Vladimir Putin's terms will never be accepted in Ukraine. That's why this idea of a popular referendum is so fascinating. You may actually see the Ukrainian people given a choice. It's going to be a horrible one, to be sure. But everyone expects here that there is no prospect for peace on Vladimir Putin's terms.
Yeah, Dmitry, go ahead.
Well, again, I didn't want to talk about the past, but about the future. But so many incorrect facts were mentioned that I would have to return a little bit to the past. Finland de facto became a NATO member in 2014, right after Russia started indeed to resist eastward expansion of NATO in 2014. Finland, you can check it, conducted dozens of joint military exercises with NATO next to St. Petersburg, in the Baltics, on the land. It stationed NATO troops on its territory, in the framework of these exercises. The same is true about Sweden. So it's a lie to say that Putin made Finland and Sweden members of NATO by aggravating the war in 2022. This is simply not true. They de facto became members long before. The same about the territorial concessions or not concessions. No one is talking about peace on Putin's terms in Russia. We are talking about compromise. What is going on is a tragedy. People are dying. As we know, the best way to end a war, especially a civil war, and I'm pretty sure what we have with Ukraine is a civil war, is a compromise. Civil wars which end with a victory of one side are tragedies. We know it from our experience where the Reds just prevailed over the Whites And that's why this civil war continues now in the minds of people even now. So we want a compromise. We suggest a compromise. What we face from the other side are accusations, and what we just heard. You can call Putin all sorts of names. You can call Trump all sorts of names. They at least did something. The EU did not do anything to stop the fighting. The Ukrainian leadership did not do anything to suggest any kind of compromise. So if someone can do better than Trump and Putin, let them try. But so far, we haven't heard any real peace suggestions. We haven't heard any real peace moves. If Mr. Biden had been in power now, there would be no such steps, but we know he didn't do anything to stop this.
You know what? We're going to have to actually then see how the next steps unfold, and I'm sure we'll be rejoining each other in the days and weeks to come to see how this moves forward, especially with this. Alexander, go ahead very, very quickly.
Just briefly, I mean, talking about a civil war in 2025, when we have around 1 million or close to 1 million, it was 700,000 at some point, Russian troops stationed in occupied Ukraine, I think that's a leap. That's really untenable. Just want to make that clear to everyone.
Okay, Thomas, I can see you agree. Okay, that will have to be the final word, though, is we are completely out of time for this edition of the Newsmakers. Thank you all three so much for joining us, and our viewers for being with us as well. Remember, you can follow us on social media, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.